have a subject this morning that has been generally neglected, but it seems to me is one of the most vital stories in the development of the human family in the last 500 years. Most of you are aware of what were called the utopians, the individuals who dreamed of a better world and made various writings to indicate symbolically the possibility of a perfect civilization. We have the utopia of More, which was an established community of dedicated people. We have the utopia of André in his Christianopolis, the Christian Commonwealth. We had the Campanella, City of the Sun, a Catholic social city of the future. We had Bacon's New Atlantis, established as a symbolical site somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. All these were on paper. The only utopia that we know of that was actually established in modern times was established by William Penn in his position as possessor and proprietor of the estates of Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Quaker, and this in itself has much to do with his concepts, his convictions, and his beliefs. And he has come to be honored today as one of the greatest exponents of human rights. He was born in England in 1644 and was the son of an English admiral. He was well educated and well positioned, and it was assumed that someday he would become a member of the British court. However, he did not think this way. He was one of those who was born with a job, and the inclination to that job took in early and dominated him throughout his entire life, which extended about 74 years. William Penn was a follower of a group of people in serious and desperate troubles in England. When the power of the Roman Church in England was overthrown by Henry VIII, the Church of England came into existence, and it was very largely dominated by the political overshadowing of the government. The Church of England required an oath of allegiance to the person of the king. Dissenters rejected this, and dissenters were numerous, and dissenters were badly treated. And among the dissenters were those who we now know as the Friends and as the Quakers. They were persons who believed that the answer to our religious problem is very simple. We only have to take the words of Jesus as we find them in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Last Supper and in one or two other short sections and live them. It was not necessary to theologize them. It was not proper or needed that we should build a church around thou shalt not kill. This is not a matter for theology or for the formation of an elaborate ecclesiasticism. It is a simple moral fact. And this moral fact must be lived by every Christian if he expects to benefit from his religion. Actually, therefore, the need for a clergy, as far as the Quakers were concerned, was not great enough to warrant the establishment of a permanent physical church. What was necessary was a series of dedications, a realization within ourselves that the various rules of our religion are not fulfilled by acceptance. We can join anything we want and accept any system of culture that we desire to accept, but this has little or nothing to do with our own personal moral integrity. We are not saved by memberships. We are not lifted out of the despond of ignorance simply by being told what to think, how to think, and when to think. Penn was, in early life, subjected to the influence of one of these free thinkers in England, and later on the continent. He became aware of the fact that there was a level of personal integrity which constituted a personal alliance with the divine plan, an acceptance of the will of God, not by the mind, but by the heart and the hand, and the willingness to do the things that are necessary to make religion work. He was, of course, surrounded by many different sects and beliefs, both in England and on the continent. But in almost every case, he found that all sectarianism led to confusion. All sectarianism divided religion. It made people claiming the same faith deadly enemies. It caused one group of Christians in Massachusetts to actually execute 3 Christians of another sect. Such policies are reprehensible. That the individual should use his religion to advance his economics, his politics, or any other temporal secular purpose was against the Word of God. Now, of course, in even those days, it would be very difficult for a person to live completely and solely upon the authority of his own acceptance of the words of Christ. Therefore, as might be expected, others who believed in the words of Christ violently persecuted the Quakers and those of similar groups, the Pietists and the Amish peoples. They could not tolerate the idea that the great foundations of physical theology should be disrupted. To them, an attack upon their sect was an attack upon God. And the idea was strongly emphasized by one clergy after another that God demanded that the members of a certain faith serve that faith alone, and if necessary, attack and destroy any other faith based upon the same book. This problem reached into the heart of Penn at a comparatively early age. It became obvious to him that somewhere in this picture of things was a great hypocrisy, and that someone, somewhere, somehow, must do something about it. He was by nature, as we learned from biography, a rather quiet man, a gentle person, an individual with a good nature, a kindly heart, and a quick wit. He was not a heavily burdened man, held down by the profundity of a great religious conviction. He was a simple person who rolled up his sleeves and said, if we believe it, do it, and accept no substitute for the action. This, of course, got him into trouble in England, and on several occasions he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. But he did not stay or change his ways, and in one of his imprisonments he wrote his most popular book, No Cross, No Crown. Actually, there were a good many dissenters of like mind floating around at that time, and nearly all of them were in very desperate straits. And it came upon Penn in the course of his life to try to make some major change in the social condition of the people around him. Grants of land were being given in the New World. There were grants for New Jersey, there was a grant for Virginia, there were other grants. And finally, Penn approached the king, Charles II, and asked to be given an apportioned part of the English area in the Western Hemisphere. Now, most of us remember Charles II as a more or less good-natured person. He was the help to found the Royal Society, was an ardent follower of the teachings of Bacon, and was in all not a bad man. He was not very popular at first. He wasn't very happy over the fact that his father had been executed, but he did gradually win the approval and general cooperation of the English people. After a long period under Cromwell, they were glad to get anything else. So Charles was more or less open to consideration, and he was willing to consider allowing or permitting Penn to possess some of the land grants which the English crown held in the Western world. Of course, in that gentle situation, Penn had to buy the right to the land. He paid no exorbitant price, but it was a substantial amount for a private citizen to buy an area which was later to become as large as the state of Pennsylvania. But Penn made the necessary arrangements, and before he left the king, he said to him, he said, I bought this from you. I'm very grateful, but I cannot accept this as a true sale. I pay you because it's the way it's done. But I do not agree with the idea that you had a right to sell it to me. Now, if Charles hadn't been a good-natured soul, that would have been about the last we would have heard of William Penn. But Charles was good-natured. But he said, you've paid me for it, so why pay somebody else? Oh, he says, the real owners of that land are the Indians, and they are the ones I'm going to buy it from. This was the beginning of the new attitude which was to rise with William Penn. So having gradually worked out his problems, he established himself, was through the crown established, as the proprietor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. At the Capitol building in Harrisburg now, there's a remarkable series of mural paintings, life-size, called The Holy Experiment. This is the experiment of William Penn's settlement of a new commonwealth in the Western Hemisphere. These paintings carry through the original visions and mystical experiences of Penn, and having passed through his life, show how this experience and experiment was advanced by George Washington and finally consummated by Abraham Lincoln. So to the people of Harrisburg and other parts of Pennsylvania, Penn is a really heroic figure and a very important one. Having gotten some land to his possession, he became aware of the fact that on both sides of him were land grants that were locked in a desperate struggle with the Indians. The land grants were in the hands of persons who believed that some foreign monarch had the right to hand them this land without any permission from the Indians who lived here. So Penn started immediately to create a new relationship with the Indians. He not only bought the land again from them, paying in terms that they could appreciate and understand, giving them valid certificates of exchange and ownership, and began to develop on a very friendly basis with these Indians. They liked him very well. Many of the chiefs came and visited with him, and all the time he was working to assure them that as the original aboriginal peoples of this hemisphere, they also had inalienable rights. And he proved it by definite references to the Bible, which did not approve of slavery. So he did not enslave the Indians, or make any effort to. He accepted them as equals, equal in sharing with his dream. Now, this may have had a better meaning and a better significance than we first realized, because the average historian of the subject is unaware of the Great League of the Iroquois. The entire eastern seaboard from Canada to the tip of South Carolina was under a great Indian alliance. This alliance, the League of Nations, was an early effort to end the fighting of the tribes themselves. This league was to create a common government which all the Indians of the seaboard areas up to Canada would accept and abide by. The great symbol or purpose of this league was called the Long House, namely that this earth has one roof, the sky, And in that long house, which is the world, all the peoples of the earth must live in peace together, must share their goods equally, and do what is necessary to protect the natural resources and prevent the confusion or evil from arising among the people. Dagan Ovida, who was the leader of this great league, therefore had established something that was almost parallel to Penn before he got there. And in so doing, they could specially appreciate the idea of including him under the roof of the long house. Some of the other tribes were in deadly combat with the colonists, who were destroying everything and killing all the Indians they could, and then accusing the Indians of cruelty if they had any reaction to try to reclaim what they had been stolen from them. Penn, on this hand, therefore, had a great alliance and a great leadership with these Indians. They appreciated what he did. They admired his integrities. They knew his word was his bond, and therefore that he could be depended upon to be fair in everything. In honor of this, they created the Penn Peace Belt, which is in Philadelphia Museum, in which the motif is a red man and a white man holding hands together. This was Penn's attitude on this subject. He believed firmly also that he was not speaking as a proprietor of a state. He was not speaking as the owner of properties. He was speaking according to the will of God, according to the truths of God, on the grounds that all living things are creatures of God. And to defame, defile, or destroy the least of these is against the will of God. Here we have a curious circumstance, therefore. A man trying to create a political structure completely religious and completely untheological. This has continued to be the great strength and power of the Quakers ever since. And in many cases, they have been called upon to arbitrate difficult situations as the only group that all the world seems to admit to be of honorable intention. So Penn then went on to other things, what were happening in England and on the continent that he felt were wrong. He found, for instance, that it was necessary to create laws that were equal for all persons. After theology, the next thing that had to be eliminated was politics, and this was a mighty job. Of course, those who came over with him were more or less of his mind. He didn't have to work with a completely foreign group. They admired him. Many of them were Quakers and Pietists themselves. Therefore, they were willing to accept his thinking that all public administration was a responsibility to serve and not an opportunity to gain. Every one of the important laws that were passed must be passed for the benefit of the citizenry in general, never for the advantage or advancement of individuals. The next problem that came to his attention was the need of education. Out here in the wilderness where he was carving a state, it was necessary that the educational structure should be advanced as rapidly as possible. Now, what kind of education do you need in the wilderness? This was something he had to work with also. Many of those who came with him were rustics. Some were previously successful businessmen. But education in the New World had to be based upon some values. Therefore, the purpose of education was to teach the individual to use natural resources without abusing them. The educated individual is the one who protected the world in which he and everyone else must live. The moment an individual takes personal advantage, he endangers the whole world. So in Pennsylvania, behind the trees, Penn worked out an idea that all leadership was to be aimed directly at the advancement of the understanding and insights of people toward self-reliance, independence, and common unity of purpose. The individual should be free two cooperate. This was quite a new thought also. I would have shaken England if it had gotten there at that time. But fortunately, it was on the other side of the ocean. And Dick's point that in connection with education was that no matter what the individual had been before, in the new world which he was building for himself and others, he must do the things that are necessary. Therefore, regardless of his background, he must do the work of the day and do it with a whole heart, not for advancement, not for leisure, not to own, but to share in the creation of a better way of life for all concerned. It was also here that William Penn introduced, strangely enough, trial by jury of the peers. In other words, in England or most countries at that time, if you didn't like a man, you whispered to someone and they threw him into the Bastille or something of that name. The average accused person had no defense. Therefore, the first thing that Penn decided about this was that anyone accused of anything must have adequate defense. He must be able to express his own problem. He must be able to call his witnesses and not simply permit the judge and his periwig to hand down a decision without asking anyone or consulting any legal documents. So Penn set up a jury system in which the accused person was entitled to defend himself before a jury of his peers. Now, this jury, of course, was made up of people of the same community in which he lived. They were mostly people of his same belief, and being puritanical or being actually members of the Quaker or Friends organizations, they were inclined to leniency. And therefore, the criminal code was far less cruel than it had ever been before. And capital punishment was restricted to two crimes only, intentional murder and treason. Everything else had to be arbitrated without pain or torture. The next thing that he decided on was that he did not want prisons. Prisons didn't seem to him to be the right kind of way of treating people who were doing wrong. He says, why should we have prisons, lock these people up in dungeons, and at the same time we have forests to cut down and no one to do it? So the answer to this was very friendly. Instead of putting people in prison for various crimes, they were given jobs under supervision and paid their penalties by contributing their time and their lives to the improvement of the colony. This seemed to have certain value with the general advancement of the whole project. Little by little, the colony flourished. It flourished largely because of the leadership of this one man who kept on fitting the words of God into the life labels of people. He was a devout man, is said to have had mystical experiences and to have had certain psychic inner life factors. He felt himself ordained and predestined to do the job he did. But because of this, as he himself says, when you go to work for the highest power in the universe, you must go its way. You must do what it requires, regardless of yourself. Therefore, he received many penalties. He had a very painful life in many respects. He was in prison, he was ridiculed, he was physically assaulted, but it did not make the slightest difference to him. He would continue to do what he was supposed to do, or believed that he was supposed to do, and he finally made a magnificent job of it. Now,